They built a cage. They locked the door. But they completely forgot that a revolutionary does not ask a neocolonial judge for permission to breathe. The courtroom was packed. The cameras were rolling. The white establishment of South Africa, puppet-mastered by the racist shadows of AfriForum, watched with bated breath as a brutal judgment was read into the historical record. 5 years, 60 months. That is the exact price tag the Pretoria Syndicate placed on the head of a leader who dared to challenge their absolute economic supremacy across the Southern Hemisphere. The elites celebrated. The Western media cheered. They thought they had finally severed the head of the Pan-African snake that was threatening to expropriate their stolen wealth without a single penny of compensation. They were blind. They were arrogant. What nobody realized was that Malema had already anticipated their rigged theater, secretly preparing a devastating 72-hour counterstrike that wouldn't just keep him out of prison but would expose the entire South African justice system as a fragile colonial illusion. The prosecutor slipped. The mask fell. We now have undeniable proof that this trial was never about justice, but rather a coordinated political assassination attempt, orchestrated by the exact same global forces currently bleeding West Africa dry. Forget the firearm, forget the verdict. In the next few minutes, we are going to uncover the fatal mistake the state made before the sentence was even passed, and exactly how this underground war in Pretoria connects directly to the unstoppable fire Ibrahim Traoré just ignited across the Sahel. The gavel fell. The flashbulbs popped. For a brief moment, the Western media believed they had finally won the war for South Africa's future. They plastered the headlines across every major network from London to New York. The BBC, CNN, and the compromised local press moved in perfect synchronization. They painted a picture of a rogue politician finally facing the undeniable consequences of his chaotic actions. 5 years in prison for firing a weapon. A simple criminal matter. That is the narrative they force-fed to the global public. It was a lie. It was a distraction. What the cameras captured that day was not the administration of justice, but rather a desperate, calculated strike by a dying neocolonial establishment. The Pretoria Syndicate, that invisible network of old apartheid money and Western corporate interests, is trembling. They are terrified. They look at the shifting tectonic plates of African geopolitics in 2026, and they realize their grip on the continent's wealthiest prize is slipping away faster than they can control. They called it stability. We call it a cage. The system was never designed to protect the African majority, but rather to legally shield the vast fortunes stolen over centuries of brutal exploitation. When a leader emerges who refuses to apologize for demanding the return of the land, the system does not debate him. It weaponizes the courts. It uses the very laws written by the oppressor to criminalize the resistance of the oppressed. This is not a new tactic. It is the oldest trick in the colonial playbook. Look at the presiding officer. Look at the magistrate. She sat elevated above the courtroom, draped in the black robes of supposed impartiality. She demanded respect. She expected compliance. But beneath that veneer of legal authority operated the very clear, undeniable machinery of the Pretoria Syndicate. Julius Malema did not hesitate to tear down the facade. He stood before the world and called her exactly what she was, a racist of note, an agent of AfriForum, a willing participant in a grand political charade. The mask has slipped. The colonial dollar is bleeding. AfriForum is not just a civil rights organization, as they falsely market themselves to the international community. They are the financial and ideological heirs of a white supremacist regime that never truly surrendered power, but simply relocated from the parliament building to the corporate boardrooms and judicial chambers. When the name AfriForum was mentioned in the legal arguments, the magistrate could not hide her visceral reaction. She jumped. She panicked. Her emotional response betrayed her true allegiance. She claimed she did not know about the reference. She said she needed to read the documents. She exposed her own absolute incompetence in real time. The heads of argument had been submitted 2 months prior to that very moment, 2 entire months. Yet she entered the courtroom completely oblivious to the contents of the defense's legal strategy. You are dealing with a magistrate who does not read. You are dealing with an officer of the court who uses raw, unfiltered emotion instead of the cold, hard text of the law. Why would a magistrate refuse to read a simple 21-page document? Why would she spend 3 grueling days reading a final judgment? The answer is chilling. The answer is obvious. She did not write that judgment herself. The Pretoria Syndicate drafted the blueprint of Malema's demise in a closed-door meeting, far away from the scrutiny of the public eye. They handed her a script. They gave her the instructions. She was merely the assigned actor playing her part in a neocolonial theater designed to destroy the economic freedom fighters. Africa is not asking permission anymore. The youth of the continent are wide awake. They see the glaring hypocrisy of a system that sentences a black man to 5 years in prison for a single bullet, while the architects of mass economic starvation walk free in the affluent suburbs of Cape Town. No sober, uncompromised judge would ever arrive at such a draconian determination. A 5-year sentence for a single discharge of a firearm that harmed absolutely no one is completely unprecedented. The punishment was never meant to fit the crime. The punishment was designed to decapitate a revolution. They wanted him locked in a cell so the masses would lose hope. But they severely underestimated the resilience of a movement born from the dust and blood of the marginalized. The EFF is not a country club for the political elite. It is the organized rage of the dispossessed. When you attack their commander-in-chief, you do not demoralize the ground forces. You radicalize them. You confirm every single warning he has ever issued about the ruthless nature of the white establishment. The Pretoria Syndicate thought they were digging a grave for a politician. They were actually pouring gasoline on a continent-wide fire. They tried everything before this moment. They confiscated his houses. They attacked his finances. They closed every possible door, hoping he would quietly fade into the background of history like so many compromised leaders before him. He lost everything. He gained it back triple. They wrote him off, carried coins, and declared his political career dead and buried. Still, he emerged from the concrete. He continued to rise because his destiny is not dictated by the men and women who hijacked the wealth of South Africa. His trajectory is guided by the ancestors of the soil. They are fighting a ghost they cannot kill. The West is trembling. When the sellouts left the EFF, the media gleefully predicted the immediate collapse of the party. A few individuals departed. 700,000 new fighters enlisted in the ranks immediately. The syndicate fundamentally misunderstands the nature of the beast they are trying to slay. You cannot destroy an ideology by locking up a man. You cannot silence the demand for economic freedom by putting a gag on a single microphone. The roots go entirely too deep into the suffering of the people. The court proceedings were heavily militarized. The state deployed specialized police task forces into a room filled mostly with elderly citizens. Why the masks? Why the heavily armed intimidation tactics? They wanted to provoke a violent reaction. They wanted to create a chaotic scene so they could point their cameras and label the EFF as violent thugs disrupting the sacred halls of justice. But the fighters maintained their iron discipline. They refused to take the bait. They stared down the barrel of state-sponsored provocation and smiled. This entire spectacle was a desperate flex of dying muscle. The Pretoria Syndicate realizes that their time is rapidly running out. The geopolitical landscape of 2026 is unforgiving to those who cling to neocolonial control. Across the continent, from the streets of Johannesburg to the dusty plains of the Sahel, the youth are connecting the dots. They recognize that the same invisible hand manipulating the magistrate in Makanda is the exact same hand funding terrorist insurgencies in West Africa to protect European resource monopolies. It is one interconnected war. The old guard is terrified because they have lost control of the narrative completely. They can no longer hide behind the polite language of international law and diplomatic protocol. We see the strings attached to their puppets. We see the bank accounts funding their legal hitmen. Malema stood in that courtroom, looked directly at the physical embodiment of the white supremacist system, and smiled. He told her goodbye. He refused to show an ounce of the fear they so desperately wanted to consume. He knew something they didn't. He knew the entire case was built on a foundation of sand held together by the arrogant assumption that Black people do not understand the intricacies of the law. He knew the state had already made a catastrophic procedural error that would inevitably blow the entire judgment out of the water upon appeal. But while the media celebrated what they thought was the end of Julius Malema, they completely missed a fatal mistake made by the prosecutor. A slip-up so massive, it proved the entire trial was a staged theater. The arrogant always stumble. The powerful always make mistakes. The Pretoria Syndicate was so confident in their absolute control over the South African justice system that they forgot to cover their tracks. They orchestrated a highly publicized trial. They deployed special police forces to intimidate the public. They spent millions of state resources to guarantee a conviction that would end Julius Malema's political trajectory. But in their rush to deliver the final killing blow, they committed a blunder so amateurish, it borders on the absurd. Let us examine the evidence. Let us look at the timeline. The entire legal foundation of this 5-year prison sentence rests on a catastrophic procedural violation that no self-respecting court could ever ignore. Accused number 2. The individual charged alongside the commander-in-chief was told to retrieve his confiscated firearm. This sounds like a standard procedure after an acquittal, but there is a glaring radioactive problem with this sequence of events. The prosecutor told him to fetch the gun a full day before the magistrate read the final judgment. How did he know? How did the state prosecutor possess psychic knowledge of a verdict that had allegedly not yet been delivered? The answer exposes the rot at the core of the system. The magistrate, supposedly an impartial arbiter of justice, had illegally communicated the outcome to the state. The judge and the prosecutor were operating as a single, coordinated entity. They were not adversaries in a court of law. They were co-conspirators in a political lynching directed by the Pretoria Syndicate. To lie to a court is a criminal offense. To manipulate evidence is a perversion of justice. The prosecutor stood before the defense and committed perjury with the absolute confidence of a man who knows the system will protect him. He claimed he handed the weapon over after the not guilty verdict was pronounced. He lied. He blatantly fabricated the timeline, forgetting that the bureaucratic machinery of the state requires a signature, a date, and a time stamp for every piece of evidence released from police custody. The documents do not lie. The time log shows the weapon was collected before the judgment was ever passed. This is not a minor clerical error. This is undeniable, documentary proof of a predetermined outcome. The prosecutor gave himself a power he does not possess. He bypassed the authority of the bench, seized evidence, and disposed of it without a formal judicial directive. Why? Because the script had already been written. The ending had already been decided in the shadow-filled boardrooms of AfriForum long before the cameras started rolling. The West is trembling. The colonial dollar is bleeding. They are terrified because their most sophisticated tools of oppression are being dismantled in real time by the very people they seek to subjugate. The arrogance of the prosecutor is a symptom of a much larger disease. He suffers from the delusion of unearned authority, a common affliction among those who serve as willing foot soldiers for neocolonial interests. He believed that wearing the badge of the state granted him immunity from the consequences of his own corruption. But the economic freedom fighters do not play by the rules of the oppressed. They do not accept the narrative handed down from the master's table. Malema did not beg for leniency. He did not cower before the bench. He immediately identified the misconduct, isolated the prosecutor's lie, and ordered his legal team to open a criminal case of perjury against the state's own representative. He is sitting on their neck. He is demanding that the prosecutor be arrested, disciplined, and publicly humiliated for treating the law as a personal playground. This is how you break the syndicate. This is how you shatter the illusion. You do not just complain about the injustice, you weaponize their own arrogance against them. The magistrate must be reported to the commission. Her secret communications with the prosecution constitute a severe ethical violation that invalidates the entire proceeding. She compromised the integrity of the court to serve an invisible hand, and now that hand is exposed to the harsh light of public scrutiny. They thought they were dealing with a frightened politician. They were actually dealing with a seasoned tactical commander. Africa is not asking permission anymore. The days of accepting rigged trials and predetermined sentences are over. The EFF understands that the courtroom is not a sanctuary of justice, but a battlefield where the oppressor uses the gavel as a weapon of war. And on a battlefield, you must exploit every single vulnerability your enemy exposes. The prosecutor's slip was not just a legal error. It was a psychological revelation. It showed the entire African continent that the white establishment is not invincible. They are sloppy. They are desperate. They are so eager to eliminate their political rivals that they abandon the very democratic principles they claim to champion on the global stage. They lecture African nations on the rule of law, yet they operate kangaroo courts in their own backyard to protect their stolen wealth and historical privilege. The hypocrisy is staggering. The double standard is blinding. Imagine for a single second if a black magistrate in a Pan-African court had secretly conspired with a prosecutor to convict a white corporate executive of a crime. The international community would erupt. The United Nations would issue immediate sanctions. The BBC and CNN would run endless documentaries about the total collapse of the rule of law in South Africa. But because the victim of this judicial fraud is a black leader fighting for economic liberation, the Western media remains entirely silent. Their silence is complicity. Their silence proves they are a direct extension of the Pretoria Syndicate. But the silence of the media does not matter when the ground forces are awake. The EFF has meticulously documented every single lie, every single contradiction, and every single abuse of power demonstrated in that courtroom. They are compiling a dossier of corruption that will be dragged all the way to the Constitutional Court. They are not retreating. They are advancing on all fronts with lethal legal precision. Let us look deeper into this invisible hand. The magistrate did not act alone. A judge who cannot read a 21-page document does not possess the intellectual capacity to orchestrate such a complex web of deceit independently. She was instructed. The syndicate demands absolute loyalty from its judicial operatives. They cannot afford a fair trial. A fair trial means examining the material conditions that create the conflict. A fair trial means acknowledging that the laws governing South Africa's economy are fundamentally illegitimate, written during an era where black bodies were considered cheap labor, not citizens with equal rights. Therefore, they must rely on the dark arts of legal sabotage. They must whisper the verdict into the prosecutor's ear the night before. They must coordinate the media coverage to ensure the public only sees the condemnation, not the corruption behind it. This is the exact same methodology used by the Paris Cartel in West Africa. When an African leader steps out of line, they do not debate policy. They freeze assets. They sponsor coups. They use international courts to issue arrest warrants based on fabricated evidence. The Pretoria Syndicate is simply the Southern African branch of this global neocolonial enterprise. The trial in Marikana was supposed to be a burial. It has instead become a public autopsy of a dying colonial system. The prosecutor thought he was a genius for returning the gun early. He thought he was playing a sophisticated game of legal chess. In reality, he handed Malema the exact ammunition needed to blow the entire case wide open. The state's case is a house of cards, built on perjury, maintained by racism, and funded by those who fear the inevitable redistribution of African land. But knowing the game is rigged is only half the battle. Surviving the trap requires a level of strategic brilliance that the oppressor never sees coming. They thought cornering him in that courtroom would force him to surrender. They didn't know Malema had already anticipated their trap, and what he deployed next was straight out of a military playbook. The trap was set. The cell was waiting. The Pretoria Syndicate desired nothing more than the profound psychological victory of forcing the commander-in-chief to spend a single night sleeping on a cold concrete floor. They did not need a decade behind bars to achieve their immediate political goal. They simply needed one photograph, one humiliating headline, one brief moment where the African youth looked at their screens and saw their most vocal defender reduced to a caged prisoner of the neocolonial state. That single image would be worth billions in foreign investment to the elite establishment. It is a classic tactic of psychological warfare. You break the leader, you break the movement. The magistrate held the power to deny bail, to force him into a holding cell, while the slow, agonizing bureaucracy of the legal system processed his appeal. She knew this. The prosecutor knew this. The entire white establishment of South Africa was banking on this exact sequence of events. They thought they were dealing with a traditional political party that relies on petitions, protests, and polite legal requests to survive. They were completely wrong. They were fatally naive. What they encountered in that courtroom was not a civilian political organization, but a highly disciplined, hyper-organized paramilitary apparatus operating with the precision of a frontline combat unit. The economic freedom fighters do not beg the oppressor for mercy. They outmaneuver the oppressor with overwhelming logistical superiority. While the magistrate was slowly, painfully reading her compromised judgment, a shadow operation was already in full effect. Look at Marikana. Look at the High Court. While the media's cameras were hyper-focused on the circus in East London, the EFF's deputy president was stationed hundreds of kilometers away in Grahamstown. He was not there as a spectator. He was a forward commander deployed behind enemy lines. He sat in the High Court with comprehensive, airtight legal papers already drafted, stamped, and ready for immediate filing. He was waiting for the exact millisecond the magistrate in East London attempted to deny bail. This is not politics. This is war. You do not enter a battlefield without a contingency plan for every single maneuver your enemy might attempt. If she goes this way, we go the other way. If she closes the door, we tear off the roof. The EFF understood that the magistrate was taking instructions from an invisible hand. Therefore, they bypassed her entirely. They created a parallel legal reality where her predetermined denial of bail would be instantly neutralized by an urgent high court application before the sun even set. But the brilliance of the counterstrike goes much deeper than just paperwork. Paperwork requires transportation. The syndicate controls the roads. The syndicate controls the traffic. They could easily manufacture a delay to ensure the legal team missed the 3 p.m. deadline at the High Court. Malema knew this. He anticipated their sabotage. So he removed the variable of the ground entirely. The rotors were spinning. The pilot was ready. A private helicopter was sitting on the tarmac at the airport, engines warm, exclusively waiting for the EFF legal team. This was not a medical evacuation. This was a tactical legal airlift designed to bypass the crumbling infrastructure of the neocolonial state. The moment the magistrate uttered the word denied, that legal team was instructed to sprint to the chopper, fly directly to Marikana, and drop the High Court injunction on the desk of a waiting, sober judge. 2 minutes. They see you here. 2 minutes. They see you on the other side. This is the ultimate power of a Pan-African movement that has finally secured its own independent resources. The white establishment is terrified because the African resistance is no longer fighting with sticks and stones. We are fighting with helicopters. We are fighting with preemptive legal strikes. We are fighting with a level of sophisticated financial and logistical independence that completely shatters their century-old monopoly on power. The West is trembling. The colonial dollar is bleeding. When you analyze this maneuver, you immediately recognize the exact same survival DNA that currently dominates the Sahel. Look at Captain Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso. Throughout the massive geopolitical shifts leading into 2026, the Paris Cartel has attempted dozens of sophisticated, highly funded regime change operations against his government. They tried to buy his generals. They tried to blockade his economy. They tried to assassinate him in the dark. He survived every single attempt. He survived because he possesses the exact same tactical paranoia that Julius Malema demonstrated in that courtroom. Traoré does not trust the institutions left behind by the French. He builds parallel intelligence networks. He anticipates the betrayal before the traitor even cashes the check. When Paris tries to corner him diplomatically, he opens a military channel with Moscow. When ECOWAS tries to starve his people, he forms the AES alliance and creates an entirely new economic bloc. This is the Traoré factor. It is the realization that the system is fundamentally designed to kill you, and therefore you must operate outside of its expected parameters to survive. Malema's helicopter is the exact same concept as Traoré's civilian defense forces. It is the physical manifestation of African self-reliance. You cannot trap a man who has already mapped out 3 different exits from the building before you even lock the front door. Look at the absolute absurdity of the state's response. The syndicate deployed heavily armed, specialized police task forces inside the courtroom. They brought men wearing tactical masks to guard an elderly judge against a room full of grandmothers and pensioners. They spent $80 million to stop a peaceful constitutional protest against load shedding, treating their own citizens like enemy combatants, yet they cannot keep the lights on or fix the bridges in the Eastern Cape. They are led by fools. They are bleeding state resources to fight a ghost they cannot comprehend. The EFF is not a group of small children. They are veterans of a psychological war. They possess the experience of a 65-year-old embedded within the bodies of the youth. When the traditional leaders, the compromised elders who sold out the continent for a seat at the corporate table, try to lecture them on procedure, they simply laugh. They have lived beyond their years. They have survived political assassinations, media smear campaigns, and absolute financial strangulation. The magistrate was paralyzed. The syndicate's plan completely collapsed in real time. When she looked down from her bench and realized that her target was not sweating, not shaking, but silently calculating the flight time to Marikana, the illusion of her power evaporated. She knew that any attempt to hold him would instantly trigger a massive, highly publicized legal defeat at the High Court, exposing her bias to the entire world before dinner time. She folded. The system retreated. Free bail. Those 2 words were a white flag of surrender from the Pretoria Syndicate. They did not grant him free bail out of the goodness of their hearts. They granted it because they were outflanked, outsmarted, and completely out-resourced by a black political movement. They realized that their cage was entirely useless against a movement that owns the sky. Malema looked at her. He looked at the physical embodiment of a racist, decaying judicial system. He simply said, bye-bye. He had seen her ugly, compromised face for far too long. He walked out of that courtroom not as a convicted felon, but as a conquering general returning to his troops. He did not pay a single cent for his freedom that day. He walked out completely unscathed to return home to the masses. And what does home mean? Home is the battlefield. Home is the relentless door-to-door campaign to dismantle the neocolonial grip on the South African economy. Home means registering the unregistered youth. Home means preparing the ground forces for the ultimate electoral takeover. The syndicate failed yesterday. They failed today. They will fail tomorrow. The sooner they accept their inevitable defeat, the better for their own psychological well-being. The resistance is adapting. The resistance is sharing tactics. The failure to cage Malema is a massive red flag for Western intelligence agencies currently monitoring the continent. If they cannot use a rigged court to take down a political opponent in Pretoria, how can they ever hope to maintain their grip on the gold and uranium in West Africa? The helicopter counterstrike kept Malema out of a cage. But the real reason this terrifies the global elite isn't just about one man in South Africa. It's about a terrifying connection that just linked Pretoria directly to Ibrahim Traoré's revolution in the Sahel. The syndicate is confused. The media is baffled. They look at the unstoppable momentum of this red wave, and they incorrectly attribute it all to the charisma of one single man. They think the EFF is Julius Malema. They think if they lock him in a cage, the entire revolution will simply pack up its bags and quietly evaporate into the African dust. This is the fatal flaw of neocolonial intelligence. They only understand movements built around political elites, completely failing to comprehend a movement forged in the absolute darkest depths of working-class trauma. The EFF was not formed in a boardroom. It was not formed by politicians. It was forged on a rocky, blood-soaked mountain in Marikana, where the white establishment ordered the mass execution of striking platinum miners to protect the profit margins of a British multinational corporation. 34 African men, 34 fathers. They were gunned down in cold blood by the police forces of their own supposedly liberated government, proving once and for all that the end of apartheid merely changed the skin color of the managers, not the brutal nature of the extraction economy. Look at the bodies. Look at the bullets. The exact same neocolonial mechanism that ordered the massacre at Marikana is the identical force that spent 60 years sponsoring military coups and assassinations across the Sahel. The Pretoria Syndicate and the Paris Cartel are two distinct branches of the exact same global corporate parasite. When a miner in South Africa demands a living wage for extracting platinum, he is shot. When a president in West Africa demands fair compensation for uranium, he is overthrown. The geographical coordinates change, but the colonial mathematics remain brutally consistent. This is why the Western establishment is currently experiencing a total systemic panic. They are no longer dealing with isolated, easily contained regional disputes. The youth of the continent are communicating. The ideological bridge between Pretoria and Ouagadougou has been permanently established, creating a unified multi-front war against Western economic hegemony that the old colonial powers simply do not have the resources to fight simultaneously. The blood of the Marikana widows is the exact same blood pumping through the veins of Ibrahim Traoré's civilian defense forces. It is a shared continental trauma that has finally weaponized itself into an organized political vanguard. They thought the EFF would die when the early sellouts defected. A few weak individuals left. 700,000 new, highly radicalized ground forces immediately flooded into the ranks to replace them. You cannot kill an organization that does not belong to its founders. The EFF belongs to the petrol attendants. It belongs to the domestic workers. It belongs to the heavily exploited security guards and the desperately unemployed youth who watch foreign corporations export their national inheritance while they starve in the townships. This movement is a hydra. This movement is immortal. If the Pretoria Syndicate actually succeeds in their darkest fantasies and assassinate Julius Malema tomorrow, they will not stop the revolution. Another Malema is already born. 1,000 new commanders will instantly rise from the ashes, armed with the exact same military discipline and an even deeper, more unforgiving hatred for the neocolonial system that murdered their predecessor. The youth are the demographic time bomb that the white establishment can no longer diffuse. They look at the parliament filled with exhausted, compromised elders, and they see only one party that actually reflects the aggressive, youthful energy of the African continent. But energy without discipline is useless. Rage without a logistical mechanism is just noise. Malema did not just deliver a speech, he delivered a strict, unyielding, tactical directive to his ground forces. The revolution will not be won with beautiful slogans alone. It will be won by brutally weaponizing the democratic process, using the oppressor's own electoral system as a Trojan horse to completely dismantle their economic control. The ultimate weapon of the modern African revolutionary is not an AK-47. It is the green, bar-coded South African identity document. You must become ruthless. You must become completely uncompromising in your social interactions. When you return to your communities, you do not politely ask people to register to vote. You force compliance through absolute social isolation. If a person attempts to enter your taxi, you demand their ID number. You check their registration status on your mobile device immediately. If they are not registered to vote for the economic liberation of their own people, you do not argue with them. You simply point them to the transport of the oppressor. This bus is exclusively reserved for the soldiers of the African future. The psychological warfare must extend into the most intimate spaces of daily life. The revolution must dictate who you associate with. If a man approaches you with romantic intentions, you halt the conversation immediately. You demand his ID. You check his registration status before you even consider sharing a single drink with him. If he is not registered, he is a danger to society. He is a willing collaborator in the continued starvation of the African child, and you absolutely do not date collaborators. You treat political apathy as a highly contagious, socially repulsive disease. This applies to your own blood. This applies to your family. As a parent, before you dish up the evening meal, you demand the ID documents of your children. You refuse to harbor enemies of progress under your own roof. When you gather for a braai, the traditional requirement of bringing your own knife for the meat has been permanently upgraded. Your knife is now your voter registration. If you are not actively participating in the dismantling of the Pretoria Syndicate, you do not get to enjoy the fruits of the community. You are exiled to the side of the apathetic, sitting with those who actively choose to remain slaves in the land of their ancestors. Look at the Eastern Cape. Look at the profound, heartbreaking contradiction of the province of legends. This is the sacred soil that produced the greatest titans of the anti-apartheid struggle. Nelson Mandela, Winnie Mandela, Oliver Tambo, Steve Biko. The Eastern Cape gave birth to the political consciousness of Black South Africa. Yet look at the brutal reality on the ground today. The people mindlessly continue to vote for the African National Congress out of a misplaced, nostalgic loyalty to a liberation movement that died a long time ago. They vote for their own destruction. They vote for the syndicate. The day after the election, after securing another victory for the corrupt, compromised leadership, the parents of the Eastern Cape are forced to carry their children across flooded, crocodile-infested rivers in coffins. Why? Because the budget allocated to build a bridge in their village was completely looted by the very politicians they just empowered. They are putting school books on their heads and risking death every single morning because their parents are trapped in a psychological prison, repeatedly validating the criminals who steal their future. This mindless loyalty must be destroyed violently. You must look at the current leadership of the ANC and recognize them for what they are, willing administrators of the neocolonial state. You honor Nelson Mandela by letting him sleep in peace, not by voting for a fraudulent, degree-stealing crook like Oscar Mabuyane. A man who steals a master's degree qualification like stolen Pampers does not represent the legacy of the struggle. He represents the absolute moral bankruptcy of a party that has fully integrated itself into the machinery of the Pretoria Syndicate. The police should not be in the courtroom intimidating the EFF. The police should be deployed to the offices of the corrupt politicians. They should be raiding the university administrators who are systematically collapsing the University of Fort Hare, selling fake degrees to maintain the illusion of African excellence, while the structural foundation of the nation rots from the inside out. But the police are controlled by the syndicate. Therefore, the people must become the ultimate law enforcement agency. The court of Macondo thought they were ending a movement. They were merely writing the prologue. The global elites watching from London, Paris, and Washington understand exactly what this means. They are witnessing the complete collapse of their century-long strategy of divide and conquer. They can no longer isolate West Africa from Southern Africa. The geopolitical consciousness has merged. A victory for Traore in Ouagadougou is celebrated as a victory in the streets of Johannesburg, and a counterstrike by Malema in Macondo sends shockwaves straight into the Élysée Palace. The West is trembling because they see the pincer movement forming. In the North, the AES alliance is forcefully ejecting the military and economic infrastructure of the Paris Cartel. In the South, the economic freedom fighters are systematically dismantling the political legitimacy of the Pretoria Syndicate. The African continent is finally executing a coordinated multi-front offensive to reclaim its total sovereignty. The era of the neocolonial puppet is over. The era of the Pan-African vanguard has officially begun. The mask has fallen, the judges are exposed, and the youth are armed with the only weapon that matters. They will never win. If you see the invisible hand linking Pretoria to Paris, if you refuse to let them silence the continent anymore, share this video to break the algorithm. And drop Africa Rise in the comments below. Let them know the vanguard is here.